Truthfully, I'm excited as we kind of dive into 1 Kings 5 and 6. I apologize if you're looking for the last video. This is probably especially for people who are online. I think everybody was here 2 sessions ago when we did that in 1 Kings, kind of end of 2, 3, and 4. That video cut out halfway through. I'm just not sure it's worth putting up the first half of an hour lesson. So I'm debating on that. And then last time we looked at that Father Brown story, and I realized actually 2 days ago when I was looking to upload it, that it's not in public domain yet. If I wait a year, it'll be in public domain, but right now it's not, so I can't post it, because otherwise I would be infringing on Chesterton's rights 70 years after he died. But I understand it, and I want to follow the rules, so that's why that one isn't up either, for those of you who are following along online. We just had a question get asked. There's a difference between the Apostles' Creed and Nicene Creed, obviously. Really, what's the difference? When do we say it? And historically, the Nicene Creed has been more commonly spoken during like communion services, and the Apostles' Creed has been more of a baptismal creed. Now, when they get their origins, that's not necessarily where they even get their origins from. The Apostles' Creed is derived from the old Roman Creed, which traces back probably, our best guess is early 300s, actually early 200s. Sorry, I'm always confused when I hear 3rd century. I think 300s, but that's not right. Early 200s. And it might even have origins a little earlier than that. And the old Roman Creed is a Western creed. So it really, when you think about ancient church history, you've got the church in the West and you've got the church in the East. Old Roman Creed, as its name might imply, is a Roman creed. It's from the Western church. And it really was primarily used, to be fair, in baptismal catechesis. So as you were going through the baptismal process, this is the creed that you would be learning. These are kind of the basics of the Christian faith. The Nicene Creed develops in the 300s. About 325 AD is when the Nicene Creed first really gets going. And it's as a result of the Council of Nicaea. This council is formulated because there's a huge controversy brewing in the church between the Arians and basically everybody else. The Arians say that Jesus isn't fully God. They'll say that he's more than just a man, but they don't want to say that he's fully God. Obviously, we would say, well, that's heresy, and that's what the church said, and that's why you get this Nicene Creed, and you can actually see it when we say the Nicene Creed. When we start talking about Jesus, what's the language that is used there? God of God, light of light, very God of very God. Yeah, you see just all of these bold proclamations that, yeah, this Jesus is God. Not the first of creation, not the first created thing. He's begotten, not made, being of one substance, being of homoousia is the Greek there, one being with the Father, by whom all things were made. And so this Nicene Creed really comes about as a way for the church to say, hey, no, we're not Arians. We don't believe that Jesus is just the first creation, the first created thing. We believe that he's begotten, but he's of one substance with the Father. This is really where we start to kind of see that whole Trinitarian idea really just kind of hammered out. And that's not to say it wasn't around before then. Don't misunderstand me. But we start to articulate it more clearly what we mean when we talk about the Trinity. So the Nicene Creed is really this beautiful gift that I would say the Spirit works through the early church so that we now, 1,700 years later, can say with boldness and confidence, yes, Jesus is the very Son of God, God himself, God of God, light of light. And this is the Spirit working through his church to bring that about. But then historically, that did end up kind of getting used more regularly in communion services, in services of the Mass, where that was going to be celebrated. Now today, we don't necessarily have that distinction. I think actually at Grace we still kind of do it. During our 8 o'clock services, we pretty regularly have the Nicene Creed spoken when there's going to be communion. I've been jumping around like crazy with it. So, sidebar here, when I'm in charge, so to speak, when I'm planning services, I'm going to say which creed is going to fit in better with what I'm preaching, is my general rule of thumb. So if I'm really trying to hammer the divinity of Christ, which one am I going to use? Nicene. If I'm really kind of just trying to focus on the life of Christ more so, I'm probably going to use the apostles. So that's why I've been jumping around a little bit if you've noticed that. But yeah, historically, I know we've used the Nicene. Yes, sir.
I have one other question. And it says during the Apostles' Creed, and he rose again from the dead. Again.
Yeah.
When does he come the first time? Where is the second time?
Yeah. That rose again from the dead isn't really saying like it's a second time that it's adding to it. It's just saying he rose again. So he came back. You could say it just that way, but just in the original language. So if you go back to the original Greek, there's that again in there. It's really, again, grammatically, it's not trying to claim that he's risen twice. It really is just saying, we actually kind of use that language, I would think, pretty regularly. He rose again in the sense that he was alive once, now he was dead, now he's alive again.
Oh, I see.
So that's kind of the...
Okay.
So I'm thinking about zombies now, which is not the most useful, I think, framework of reference. But yeah, when we're talking about again, that's all it is, that he's up again, he's moving
still,
again.
His father was around when he was man.
Yes. Yeah.
Listen to me. He is my beloved. Listen to me. He is my beloved son.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is where we get into, now we're going to go into the Athanasian Creed, our third creed, yeah. This is really why I think in the Athanasian Creed we really hammer this idea of, hey, we're not going to divide the Trinity, we're not going to divide the parts, but we're also not going to confuse the parts.
Okay.
So there is one Father, one Son, one Spirit, but there's only one God. And I will admit, I'm not a math guy, but I'm certain that math doesn't add up. 1 plus 1 plus 1 should not equal 1, and yet it does in this case. So it's one of those just weird things where we're going to understand it better in perfection. I'm confident of that. We'll kind of get to see it.
The sign language, 3 turns into 1.
Is that what it is? That's really cool, actually. I really like that. I'm going to have to start using that that'll be my action for it when we're talking about it. Yeah, no, so that's a good question, and it's one that I can only answer in part now, but I'm certain we'll have the answer in full when all things are fulfilled.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, not a problem. Great questions. We're going to dive into 1 Kings chapter 5, and we're going to be talking about a holy place. This has been a long time coming in the Old Testament narrative. We've seen David really looking forward to this moment. And now Solomon is going to start to bring to fruition the temple, this permanent place for God to dwell among his people. And this is a big deal because if we really go back in time throughout the scriptures, what's one of the big problems after we get kicked out of Eden?
Well, he has to have a place to live.
Yeah, there's a separation between us and God. Now, God has repeatedly throughout the Old Testament said, yeah, I'm breaking that separation. I'm coming to you. We've got the tabernacle. We've got all these instances. And God has even said, look, I was fine with the tabernacle. I didn't need a permanent place. But if you want to build one for me, by all means, go for it. Knock yourself out, kid, is really kind of what I picture God saying in that moment. And we're going to see kind of Solomon start to do that with this holy place, this holy temple in Jerusalem. So starting with 5 verse 1. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent his servants to Solomon when he heard that they had anointed him king in place of his father. For Hiram always loved David. We're not sure 100% why Hiram has this great love for David, and it's not recorded for us in Scripture, but I would wager that it has to do with the fact that David has taken out some of Hiram's enemies. David's kingdom has stretched far to the north. There's been a fair amount of peace, I would wager, in the land, more so as a result of his victories. Tyre, as you can see here, is just on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. This is the Dead Sea down here, so you can follow the Jordan River up. This is basically Israel. So it's just to the northwest of Israel. And actually, Tyre itself, there's this little island that juts out into the Mediterranean Sea, and that's where Tyre, the city itself, sits, is on this little island with this little land bridge that goes out to it. I've got a picture of some of the ruins. This is out on that island. You can see the Mediterranean Sea in the background. It's pretty beautiful from everything that I've seen. It's this coastal territory. It's known for its seafaring peoples for obvious reason. Like if you live on an island, what are you going to do? You're going to make boats and you're going to sail around because that's how you're going to provide for yourself. You're going to fish. You're going to trade. You're going to do all these things. It's generally a wealthy country for most of its life on account of some of the resources it has at its disposal, which we're going to see here in just a couple of verses. But Hiram, king of Tyre, he hears that Solomon has taken the throne, and he sends out an envoy. He wants to congratulate him. He wants to continue their partnership. And Solomon sent word to Hiram, "You know that David my father could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God, because of the warfare with which his enemies surrounded him, until the Lord put them under the soles of his feet." I love this verse because this is how a son should be talking about his father. And what I mean by that is, if we go back into 1 and 2 Samuel, what's the reason that God gives for why David can't build the temple?
He was a man of war.
Yeah, he's a man of war. He's got too much blood on his hands. And how does Solomon take that? And he's not lying here. I want to make sure we clarify that. I would say, in the Lutheran sense, he's doing a great job of following the 8th commandment. He's explaining this in the kindest way possible as he's talking about David. So he says, hey, my father couldn't build it. And why does he say he couldn't? Because there were so many enemies around. There were so many enemies around. He didn't have peace. He had to go, and he had to go and fight these people so that we could have peace now. Which way sounds better?
That way.
Yeah. And again, this isn't really, I don't even think this is necessarily a tremendous judgment from God on David. It's just a reality. He says, look, there's too much blood on your hands. You building this temple just wouldn't be right. You'd be doing it with your conquest. And I don't want that. I want my temple to be a place of peace, a place of growth, a place of life. And there just would be too much death on your hands for you to adequately do that. I don't see that as a judgment per se. I just see that as God saying, hey, this isn't your job. It's someone else's. And Solomon here knows this, I'm sure. He knows the reason. And he comes in here and he goes to Hiram and he says, look, this is why. Because my father was so busy doing the right thing, doing his job, going to war for us so that I could have peace in my day. It really is. It's this beautiful, just kind of uplifting from the son of what his father accomplished on his behalf. And really, this is, again, how all of us, I think, it's good for us to talk about this, or talk about our parents, talk about the people around us in this way. Again, Luther would say in the 8th commandment, hey, our job is to explain everything in the kindest possible way. That can be hard to do. I'm sure my wife would say it's harder to do for me than it is for me to do for her. But this is the setting, this is how we interact as God's people. We uplift one another with our words. And it's not lying. Again, this is not if someone is going to be horrible at a job, this is not us saying, oh, they're actually going to be really good at the job. It's us explaining it in the kindest way. Hey, they might be better suited in a different capacity. You know, this isn't where their gift lies. They're actually really good here. Why don't we try that instead?
But they were always on time.
But they're always on time now. They're so kind. Yeah,
Also,
sorry.
it's the way we as parents have to provide for our children, so they're better off than we are.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a sense where we're trying to do that, where we're trying to leave our kids in a better situation than we had. I think most parents would agree with that, and I think that's a noble thing as well, for sure. And I think we see David doing that for his son Solomon as well. Certainly, there's a two-way street there. Agreed. Verse 4 then, but now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. So notice he says, hey, this isn't my doing. The Lord has given me this peace. I have all this peace. I have rest on either side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune. And so I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. As the Lord said to David my father, your son whom I will set on your throne in your place shall build the house for my name. So he points out, hey, this is historical. This is what God has been planning. God said to my father, your son is going to be the one to do it. David, this isn't your job, it's your son's. So prep everything, let your son have stuff ready, but it's going to be his responsibility to build this temple. And again, notice too, David hears that, and if we look back at 1 and 2 Samuel, what does David do? He lays a lot of groundwork for this. He's got plans for the temple. He sets aside money so that Solomon will be able to do it. He sets aside wealth so that Solomon will be able to do this. He does a great job of tilling the field, so to speak. You can almost picture Paul here talking, right? I planted, Apollos watered, but
Right.
God gave the growth. There's that image here of, hey, I'm going to do whatever I can, but at the end of the day, I'm going to let God do the rest. What God has said he's going to do, that's what I'm going to do. And David faithfully does that, and now Solomon is about to reap the rewards, reap the benefits of that. Verse 6, now therefore command that cedars of Lebanon be cut for me, and my servants will join your servants, and I will pay you for your servants such wages as you set, for you know that there is no one among us who knows how to cut timber like the Sidonians. So Tyre and Sidon are kind of these two nations here. So you got Tyre and Sidon is right alongside it. And they work together. They're actually kind of a set. I'm truthfully not sure of the historical just partnership there, but anytime we see them in Scripture, Tyre and Sidon are almost always connected. And certainly geographically they're next door neighbors. But it appears that throughout their history they generally had a positive working relationship. And that's what Solomon is saying here. He's saying, hey, look, I will send you workers, but I also want you guys to provide workers that I'll pay. Don't worry about the payment. I got it covered. I've got my money. I'll pay up front. It'll be good. But you guys are the experts here. This is your cedars of Lebanon. These are your trees. I'm going to let you do your job. I'll pay for it, but I want you to make this so that it's going to be beautiful, so that it's going to work. And as soon as Hiram heard the words of Solomon, he rejoiced greatly and said, blessed be the Lord this day, who has given to David a wise son to be over this great people. So notice here, Hiram, this foreigner, he's not of the nation of Israel. He's in Tyre. He, again, offers this blessing up to, at least in the text here, we see that he offers this blessing up to the Lord. Capital L, the actual Lord. It's Yahweh in the text. And so, again, we can see this influence. This is what Israel's supposed to be doing. Israel's supposed to be having this influence on her neighbors. And we see that effective here. And even Hiram says, look, God has been good to you. I'm so grateful that he's put a good, wise son on the throne for my friend David. God is doing good work in Israel. And Hiram sent to Solomon, saying, I have heard the message that you have sent to me. I am ready to do all you desire in the matter of cedar and cypress timber. My servants shall bring it down to the sea from Lebanon, and I will make it into rafts to go by sea to the place you direct. And I will have them broken up there, and you shall receive it, and you shall meet my wishes by providing food for my household. So now we kind of have the deal made how this is going to work. Tyre and Sidon are going to provide the wood. They're going to provide these cedars, and what's more, they're actually going to ship them down. So they're going to harvest them from the forests of Lebanon, and they're going to then bring those big trees down the way to the sea. They're going to tie them together in rafts, and then they're going to ship the rafts down the coastline, probably down to about Joppa is our best guess. That's really the only Israeli seaport of importance. And then from Joppa, they're going to carry it over to Jerusalem, and they're going to build the temple that way. Which, does that sound a little easier than having to have horses or mules or whatever carry it all the way down through those mountains? Yeah, this is a good plan. Yeah. And really, as we talk about these cedars of Lebanon, we're talking about these beautiful trees that are just, frankly, worth their weight in gold in the ancient world. These are, if you can get a cedar of Lebanon for your construction project, this is what you want. And they use them in just about everything. And they have some reasons for this. I was reading this in Bible Reading Archaeology on a website. They have this whole section dedicated to the forests of Lebanon, to these cedars. And I thought I would just read out a couple of paragraphs for you as to why these trees are so highly sought after in the ancient world. A number of factors made the tree very desirable among the ancient people of the Middle East. First, the wood is free from knots, which made it ideal for the construction of ship masts. So that's something that they would regularly use these trees for, is they would use them to make the masts of ships. And really, in any construction project, if your wood doesn't have any knots in it, how much easier is it to use for work? A lot easier. When you're cutting it, it's not going to suddenly split in a gross way because it's perfect. There's none of those imperfections in the wood. And these cedars just don't have them. For whatever reason, God designed these trees in that way. They don't have knots. It's not something that happens.
They're also kind of rock resistant.
Yes, they are. We're going to talk about this, yeah.
Okay.
Ancient shipbuilders also prized Lebanese cedar wood because it's easily worked and shaped. Again, that goes back to some of that knot-free. It's a very smooth, soft wood. It ages with little shrinkage, and it resists rot or decay in salt water better than most types of wood. So shipbuilding was pretty common with these. That also explains why they're comfortable just shipping it down the sea, right? Is anything going to happen to the wood as it's in the water? No. It's really resistant to that salt water. They don't have to worry about that. So that's why this is part of the plan. Finally, the wood is famously resistant to decay or rot in dry conditions as well. Even a dead branch of the Lebanon cedar may lie on the ground for years before it begins to decay. So even when a branch like drops off of this, it just sits there in those dry conditions and is fine. Like you could pick it up years later and it would still look like the same stick that fell off the tree. Now obviously then when you're talking about taking one of these big boughs and cutting it off and using that in construction, how much longer is that going to last? Yeah, they're going to last a long time. In fact, if you were to go to Israel today and you were to go to Jerusalem, on the Temple Mount, where historically we think Solomon's temple was built, where the temple of Herod the Great was built, now there sits obviously the Dome of the Rock, this Islamic mosque. However, there's also a smaller mosque also nearby that comes from about the 8th century is our best guess. And as they were doing some reconstruction on this just a few years ago, probably like 10, 20 years ago, they found some cedars of Lebanon that were used in it. And they were like, oh, we're curious to see how old they are. So they start carbon dating them, and most of them are actually from literally the 8th century. So when this thing is first made, they've got these cedars that they have and they use. But in fact, some of them are from even earlier. They found some of them that are from the 1st century, so from the time of Christ. And they found some that are actually even predate Christ by like 300 years in this temple, or in this mosque. So what does that mean? In ancient Jerusalem, when they were doing these construction projects, if they had to tear down a building, an old building, to make a new one, they would take those cedars from that old building and they would stick them in the new one because they were that long-lived, that you could use them from project to project. So that even still today then in Jerusalem, you have these cedars of Lebanon that are being used as beams in these buildings from 2,000 years ago. That's how long these cedars last in these construction projects in this dry climate. Makes sense why they're pretty valuable?
Yeah.
Like, not only do you have them beautiful for that first time, but they just continue to last. They continue to be used. And they also have a beautiful aroma to them. Like when you put them in, there's just the smell of the cedar apparently that just lasts and lasts and lasts for years in these buildings. So again, as we dive into how Solomon builds this temple, you can kind of picture that smell of this cedar forest in the middle of the temple of the Lord. Kind of cool when you stop to think about it. Especially, too, when you think about the fact that right outside the door, there's all these animals that are being chopped up and slaughtered, like probably a little smelly. But you walk into the temple, and now what do you smell?
Cedar.
Just that beautiful smell of the cedars. Even the aroma of the place is depicting its holiness, depicting how special it is. Now, as to the cedars today, this is actually kind of tragic. I didn't realize this until I was prepping for this Bible study. These forests have just been decimated.
Yeah.
So right here you see kind of one of the last remaining cedar forests. These things used to just cover these hills, and due to over-harvesting, they just got destroyed. Actually, you can go back to like 200, 300 AD, and a Roman emperor realizes what is happening. He's like, we need to stop this because we are just decimating this forest. It's not going to be around. And so he makes an edict to try to preserve the land. So he makes kind of like a national park system, right? But the trees are so valuable that no one listens. They just keep going in and they keep harvesting, they keep foresting it. And so today, if you go to the forests of Lebanon, you can still find like 12 small little groves, but that's about it. And again, some of that is just how valuable they were in the ancient world. People needed them, people wanted them, they were important. But I think that does speak to us too, just, hey, when we have these beautiful gifts that God gives to us in creation, it is a good thing for us to take care of them. Not necessarily at the expense of other people, not necessarily at the expense of other parts of God's creation, but it's important, I think, that we take these gifts and we preserve them, that we use them wisely and well. Because obviously it's kind of a tragedy, I think, that we no longer really even have the means to protect this forest in a way that we could harvest it and continue to use it well.
Maybe this wasn't in your research or whatever, but didn't they replant trees? Or are they so slow growing that they take hundreds of years to get to grow? Or?
They are pretty slow growing. I think for them to mature, it takes like 100 years before you have a mature one. So it does take a while for it to get back, and they live hundreds of years, obviously. But I think it just was so decimated that it's just hard to get that population back up now. And maybe we could be planting them. I did not do any research to find, are we trying to regrow the cedars of Lebanon? Like, is that something we're in the process of doing? I hope so, because again, like, I would love to picture that beauty again being used in construction, although we use so much cheap wood now that it's probably just easier to...
Cheap wood?
Well, granted, yeah. Granted, that's a fair point. I just put together a little raised garden in my backyard, and so I had to go out and buy like lumber to do that. And I got done at Home Depot, I'm like, did I really just spend this much on wood that I'm just gonna go home and chop up and like put together for a garden that's gonna rot away in 10 years? Like, what am I doing? Like, but yeah, but again, like our resources that we're using now in general, and you've probably even seen this too. If you go back and you look at antique furniture, what's the difference between antique furniture and the furniture we're making today?
Much better material.
Yeah, it's a little different now. And I think that's sad too. That we've lost, I think, some of our craftsmanship in the name of efficiency. And I get it, like...
And price probably.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a Walmart shopper, right? I'm going to go to Walmart, I'm going to buy what's cheap and what's easy for me, because I'm thrifty. So, like, there just isn't as much of a market anymore, I think, for people going out and buying this handmade piece of furniture that costs more than I could spend on validate spending on it, right? But yeah, I think that is something that has kind of been lost a little bit in our world today. And I get it, there's reasons for it, but it does, I think, it's a little sad at the same token. There's multiple sides of that coin. So then payment-wise, so Hiram supplied Solomon with all the timber of cedar and cypress that he desired, while Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household, and 20,000 cores of beaten oil. And so just a reminder, a core is about 6 bushels. So he's giving out 120,000 bushels of wheat in payment, and 120,000 bushels of oil as payment. Like, this is pretty significant, right? That he's giving out a great deal of payment to make this happen. Truthfully, I have no concept of how much that actually is. I went to the Ark recently, the Ark Encounter. Anybody been to the Ark Encounter in Kentucky? I just was there with the 8th graders on the mission trip last week, and I was saying there, you know, it's easy for me to picture, if you tell me that something is 450 feet long by like 80 feet high, I can picture that. But then when you get me into like the actual volume that contains, that's where I was blown away. I'm walking around the Ark and I'm like, oh my goodness, there's so much space in here. There's so much room. Like, I could throw a couple of dinosaurs in here and be just fine. Like, but yeah, so truthfully, I have no concept of what 120,000 bushels of wheat or 120,000 bushels of oil looks like. You probably have a better idea than I do. I'm imagining a great deal of material, and I'm imagining that I'm still underestimating just how much it is. But Solomon is trying to be fair here as he's paying Hiram for the good work that he's doing. And the Lord gave Solomon wisdom as he had promised him, and there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty. So we see that this wisdom of Solomon continues to be of benefit to him, as he works together with Hiram here. They make this treaty, there's peace between their lands, they're getting along well, and they're having this good partnership as they're working together to build this temple. Now, King Solomon also drafted forced labor out of all Israel, and the draft numbered 30,000 men. So if we go back to when God originally says, hey, you want a king? You got to understand some things about the king. What's the king going to do? He's going to tell you where to go work, right?
What to do.
Yeah. It's good to be the king. The king gets to say, hey, you get to go out of the country for this amount of time, and you get to go help harvest these trees and send them down. I'm good in my palace, right? The king gets to make these decisions. So he drafts 30,000 men, and to be fair, I think as we see his plan here, it's actually a good plan. And I'm sure it worked out well for the workers too. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon, and then 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the draft. So these men, who I'm sure are pretty well compensated for this too, right? They're not slaves. These are Israelites who are being drafted to serve in this way. They go out, and for a month, they're in Lebanon, and they're working there, and then for 2 months, what happens? They get to come home and be with their family for 2 months. Frankly, this doesn't sound like a horrible strategy to me, at least. Like, you get that month there where you know the job, where you get to work well on the job, where it's not like you're just there for a week and then you're back for a week and there's just so much travel. It's, hey, go out there for a month, work hard, come back and be with your family for 2 months. This is a good plan. It's a plan that I'm sure worked really, really well in the lives of God's people, as Solomon needed labor to make this happen. So again, we see that wisdom here of Solomon. Solomon also had 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stone cutters in the hill country. So this is an operation, right? We've got a lot of people out there doing work, making sure that we're getting all the materials. And it makes sense, right? If we're imagining carrying these trees across the land, even just from Joppa to Jerusalem, that's 50, 75 miles, give or take. How much effort is it going to be to get those back? A lot. And then you've got your stone cutters, because they're going to make sure that there's stone involved in the construction of the sanctuary, because do you want to build your house on stone or on sand? Yeah, the wise man built his house upon the rock, right?
Yeah.
This is what Solomon wants. So you've got all of these different pieces of the puzzle here in the construction of this temple. And you've got all of these different workers that Solomon is using. Besides Solomon's 3,300 chief officers who were over the work, who had charge of the people who carried on the work. So even just kind of his foreman on the job, right? He's got 3,300 of them. This is a big project. At the king's command, they quarried out great costly stones in order to lay the foundation of the house with dressed stones. So Solomon's builders and Hiram's builders and the men of Gebal did the cutting and prepared the timber and the stone to build the house. So you've got this whole operation going. You've got all of these people who are working together to build the temple of the Lord. This is a good thing. This is a God-pleasing thing. Oftentimes I'm guilty of this too. There's this kind of double-edged sword here, two sides of the coin, where you go and you look at these great cathedrals that people have built. Literally hundreds of years spent building like a Notre Dame, which is just a tragedy that it's burnt to the ground now. And there's this temptation, I think, sometimes to just say, oh, how could you possibly spend this much money, this much wealth on building something like this? Like, we can meet in a room like this and be just fine, right? And that's true. I don't want to negate that. We never want wealth or prestige to be the sole factor of why we do things. And yet at the same time, is it a good thing to love God and want to make beautiful things for Him? I feel like, yeah, that's a good thing too. Certainly as we look at the Old Testament, do God's people regularly spend a lot of money on prepping things for God? Yeah, if you look at the tabernacle, there's this huge influx. Oh, we're going to give all of this gold, all of these jewels, all of this fine cloth, which is just as valuable as the gold in that day. Look at everything we're going to do. So I think there's that balance there of, hey, it's great when we want to glorify God with beautiful things.
God commanded it too, didn't he?
Yeah, he does in the Old Testament, certainly. There's this command of, this is what I want, go do it. In this word, maybe, it's good when we treat the holy things of God as holy. When we kind of say, yeah, this is something different. We're going to spend a different amount of time on it than we would on my raised garden in the backyard, right? There's just a little bit of different priorities there. So yeah, I think there's a beauty to this when the church as a whole does say, hey, we're going to do something beautiful. Pastor Howard actually had that sermon not that long ago where I think he touched on that a little bit. That beautiful stained glass window that got blown out, and then all of God's people together worked at just putting it together. Like, even though it didn't look right, there still was that beauty, right, of God's people saying, hey, we want to do something beautiful because God has done so much beauty for us. Now, again, it's an even greater tragedy now that that stained glass window is in a church that is empty. That's got to be our first priority. How are we making sure that we're making disciples? But I don't think there's anything wrong with also trying to emphasize beauty in worship, beauty in God's house, that sort of thing. And we have a beautiful sanctuary here too, so it's a good thing. Yeah. Maybe I'm wrong on that though, because I just love architecture. I love all of those beautiful old cathedrals. There's good stuff there, I think. But, all right, anyway. In the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is in the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. This verse is really important as we start talking about like where we date stuff in the Old Testament, because it gives us actually a pretty clear like delineating line and says, hey, at this time in Solomon's reign, this is when the temple was built. So back when we were talking about like the conquest, for instance, back if we go back almost 2 years now, back to when we were doing Joshua, and Joshua was entering into the promised land, this was the verse, if you'll recall, that we used to say this is probably about when Joshua started the conquest. Because we get this clear line of 480 years before. I'll admit there's some other scriptural stuff that maybe says, okay, maybe we're not 100% sure on dates, and that's fine. Paul, as he's talking in Acts, actually uses a different kind of counting system, I think, for his date. So we're not 100% sure when we're talking about these dates, but we're pretty sure that Solomon's reign starts in about 970 BC. So if this is his 4th year, then about 966 BC is when this temple starts getting made. This is our best guess, and we're probably pretty close on this due to just extra biblical evidence that we have archaeologically that lines up with where things are at in the Old Testament. The house that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. And so now it is time for a little temple math as we get to talk about how big this temple is. So the length is 60 cubits, the width is 20 cubits, the height is 30 cubits of just the main temple area. Now a cubit is about 18 inches, and then we know this, a foot is about 12 inches. I think I've done all the math right. Basically, you just have to multiply everything by 1.5. And so then the length would be 90 feet. The width is about 30 feet, and the height is about 45 feet. Yeah, it's not that big. If we're talking 30 feet, right? So from about where I was standing to about here is the width.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes, and maybe this is just me, I have this image of this temple as this huge, beautiful thing. And part of the problem is, most of the time when we're picturing the temple, sorry camera, most of the time when we're picturing the temple, we're picturing actually Herod's temple, the temple that Herod built on the Temple Mount, and that one is significantly larger than Solomon's temple. But the interesting thing about it is really, we could take this and we could fit this in our sanctuary pretty easy, couldn't we? Like we could just drop it right in there. Now, we don't have quite the level of gold in our sanctuary that they have in theirs. So I would wager that just in a monetary sense, theirs is a little more valuable. even though it's significantly smaller. But it's not actually this gigantic thing. Now, in the ancient world, to be fair, is 90 feet pretty tall? Or, pardon me, is 45 feet pretty tall to build a building?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that actually is relatively tall. We're going to bump this up. This is probably what? 18 feet, give or take? Maybe a little longer, maybe 20? So bump this up by twice as high, and maybe a little bit more than that, 2.5 times as high. We'll just say that. That's not actually small by any stretch of the imagination, especially in the ancient world, because, I mean, what are they using to build with?
Their hands. They didn't have cranes and
Yeah,
chainsaws
yeah.
to cut down their trees.
Yep, you don't have those things. So everything's being done by hand and by simple tools. I was just down at the zoo not that long ago. You don't have that like giant crane hanging over the hospital, right, that's moving around and lifting stuff up. You don't have that. So this still, even though it maybe feels a little underwhelming when you actually like stop and look at the feet, this is a beautiful project. And when you look at the artistry that goes into it as we read this description, I mean, there's no wonder that this takes 7 years to build. Because they want to make sure that it's beautiful, that it's perfect, that it is a place fitting for their perfect, holy God. They want this to be a holy place. And in fact, as we're going to see here, they don't even do any of the like stoneworking at the site.
Yeah.
All of the stoneworking, they do off-site and then ship the stones in. So I mean, this is just hard for me to even imagine because I'm so bad at putting things together that, like, can you imagine you're out there and you're hewing away at this stone, you're trying to make sure you get the measurements perfectly right, and then you carry this, who knows how heavy this stone is. These are big stones that they're working with. You carry the stone that weighs 200 pounds all the way back to Jerusalem and you go to put it in the slot and it doesn't fit. Like, can you imagine that? Now you have to carry it all the way back and you have to shave off a little bit more, or like...
What kind of animals do they use to do this on? Mules, horses, elephants?
It is probably mostly mules. They probably have like teams of mules. It's possible that they could have used like an ox of some sort, kind of a bigger pack animal to try to do some of this. But yeah, it's probably mostly mules that are carrying these things around, which obviously mules are stubborn animals and way stronger than we think when we look at them. So this is certainly within the ability for them to do. But yeah, they probably have like teams of mules primarily that are carrying these things from the quarry to the temple. But yeah, it is. It's just this incredible project. And I know that there are people who are gifted in this way who would be able to just see this from afar and like be like, oh, I see what I need to do. I'm going to go out. I'll do it. And they'll do it even without like measuring it. I get so jealous of those people, which is not fitting. But again, like on the mission trip just this last week, we were working with this contractor and we were building this ramp and he goes over there and without measuring anything, I'm like, well, how are you doing this? He shaves off of this like 2x4, he diagonals it like 3 different times and they're all just perfectly flat, perfectly even, and he has measured none of it and it just tapers perfectly to the ground. I'm like, this is just stupid. Like, how can anybody have this ability to do something like this? It's just unreal. I'm sure that Solomon...
He doesn't know Greek, though.
You are probably right. He probably doesn't know Greek, but in terms of what one is more valuable, and in terms of what one tends to have more practical value, I can't decide, right? Dead language, being able to put things together well with my hands. No. That's the beauty of the body of Christ, though, right? Actually.
Everybody has their gifts.
We do all have our gifts. And my gift is not in the construction field, in the field of making things with my hands. But gratefully, I have other people in my life who are good at that and are willing to offer me support and love in that as I translate ancient Greek for them. So, yeah. But yeah, I'm certain that as we look at these woodworkers and stone workers, these are those kinds of people, right? Solomon has just gifted craftsmen who are working at this. We'll read about one of them probably next week. We'll see how far we get as we go into this just kind of construction of the temple. The vestibule in front of the nave of the house was 20 cubits long. So in front of the house we have another 20 cubits, so we've got another 30 feet that we can add to the length, so now it's 120 feet long, equal to the width of the house, and 10 cubits deep in front of the house. And he made for the house windows with recessed frames. So inside this house, there's also windows, so you're getting natural light in, right? It's not just going to be oil lanterns. There's going to actually be sunlight coming in. Is that good for the beauty of the house?
Yes.
Probably, right? Sunlight, natural light is always better for pictures. I know this. He also built a structure against the wall of the house, running around the walls of the house, both the nave and the inner sanctuary, and he made side chambers all around. So in addition to this kind of basic, kind of just a box that we're talking about here, he's got these kind of side chambers that run around the entire house. They're going to be primarily used for storage or for quarters for the priests, stuff like that. So you've got all these little buildings. I'll show a picture up here. I'll just go there now.
Yeah.
So it's small, but you can kind of see some of the side chambers here in the sides of the house where everything is going to be stored when it's not in use. The lowest story was 5 cubits broad, the middle one was 6 cubits broad, and the third was 7 cubits broad. For around the outside of the house he made offsets on the wall in order that the supporting beams should not be inserted into the walls of the house. And so the way he's designing this house, it actually kind of slants out a little bit, so that way the supporting beams just are going to be able to be a little more beautified. Like they're not going to have to fit them into a direct spot. They're going to be able to just kind of hang out, which to us sounds strange, but in the ancient world this would be like a common architectural practice for both support reasons, and it was just their aesthetic. They thought it was beautiful to see that natural cedar wood instead of it being buried in the house, which makes sense when we talk about just how beautiful this wood was, how it smelled, all of that. When the house was built, it was with stone prepared at the quarry, so that neither hammer nor axe nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. This again goes back to that idea of a holy place. Do they want those sounds of construction happening where this worship is going to be happening? No. They want it to be free of that. They're looking for that peace, that quiet, that life, that goodness that can be found here alone. So yeah, when we're picturing this construction site, we're not picturing trucks beeping back and forth. We're not picturing like jackhammers rattling into the ground. There's reverence already here before it's even built. And some of that could have to do with the place. This is all happening on Mount Moriah, which is historically where Abraham is called to take his son Isaac and sacrifice him on that Mount of Moriah. This is a holy mountain in the life of Israel. So you have all of this history here. You have all of this just kind of knowledge, this reverence for what's going on. These people are taking it seriously. They want this to be a holy place by every stretch of the imagination, by every stretch of the word. The entrance for the lowest story was on the south side of the house, and one went up by stairs to the middle story, and from the middle story to the third. So he built the house and finished it, and he made the ceiling of the house of beams and planks of cedar. He built the structure against the whole house, 5 cubits high, and it was joined to the house with timbers of cedar. So what he's saying here too is there's also a southern entrance. The temple is actually going to be facing east, which is pretty regular in terms of what we're seeing in ancient architecture for temples. In pagan cultures, this is largely because what a lot of them worship? The sun. So you're worshiping that rising of the sun as it rises in the east. For the Hebrews, I don't know if this is actually true or not. I was just reading a couple articles about this. There was this sense that actually back in the Garden of Eden, you would have the trees, those 2 trees, tree of life, tree of knowledge of good and evil, they're on a hill in the middle of the garden. And so when Adam and Eve get kicked out, they get kicked out actually to the east. And so then to get back to the trees, which way do you have to go? West. And so then there's this imagery with the tabernacle. The tabernacle is always set up the same way. The tabernacle was always set up facing east, that as you enter into the tabernacle, as you enter into the holy place, you're moving closer to God. You're moving westward, closer to God. As you enter into the Holy of Holies, you're, again, getting even closer to God. So there's this idea that moving east to west gets you closer to God in Hebrew culture. That's how they design it. And in fact, even in a lot of Christian churches, you see a lot of them are built facing east. Not anymore, this is more of a traditional thing. And again, it actually had more to do with the idea of, hey, this was how the old temple was built, this is how the tabernacle was set up, we want to set it up the same way. And the idea also was this idea of, hey, when we see Christ return, it's going to be like the sun coming back, or the sun rising upon us. So we want to be facing east, because that's how the sun is going to return. I don't know if that's true or not. I can understand the mindset, though, right? You've got that sun that crosses the horizon, and suddenly there's all this light, there's day, it's life again. In the same way, when the sun returns, S-O-N, sun, we're all going to see him. And he's going to bring light and life to us as well. Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon concerning this house that you are building. If you will walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you, which I spoke to David your father. And I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel. So God comes to him and he says, hey, great, you're doing this building, but what's more important even than the building itself?
Keeping my commandments.
Yep, being my people. Following my commands, keeping my commandments, obeying what I say to you. If you do that, then I will always dwell among you. Now, of course, what's the problem with God making this commandment contingent upon sinful humans?
We can't do it.
We can't
Yeah.
do it.
Well, this is really the beauty of that new covenant that Jeremiah writes about, that Jesus fulfills at the Last Supper when he says, hey, this cup is the new covenant, or New Testament, either way you say that. It actually means the same thing. New Testament, new covenant in my blood. He's saying, look, that covenant that Jeremiah promises, that's not like the old covenant, the covenant you see here ratified with Solomon. This covenant is dependent upon us, upon our work, upon our fulfillment of the law. How well did that work out for Israel?
Not good at all.
Not well at all. This beautiful temple gets
Destroyed.
totally destroyed because they're unable to fulfill their end of the bargain. Now, God still dwells with them. God actually still fulfills his end of the bargain. He still continues to come to them. In fact, he sends his son to live among them as one of them. But the human side of that arrangement was never going to work. And that's why we need that Savior. We need that perfect new covenant that's built not on our work, but on the work of Christ. Yeah, and we see that. So Solomon built the house and finished it. He lined the walls of the house on the inside with boards of cedar. From the floor of the house to the walls of the ceiling, he covered them on the inside with wood. And he covered the floor of the house with boards of cypress. He built 20 cubits of the rear of the house with boards of cedar from the floor to the walls, and he built this within as an inner sanctuary, as the most holy place. The house, that is the nave in front of the inner sanctuary, was 40 cubits long. The cedar within the house was carved in the form of gourds and open flowers. All was cedar, no stone was seen. So they have this foundation of stone, this base of stone, but what are they covered all with?
Wood.
Yeah, it's all of this cedar, all of this wood. You can't see any of the stone. And it's almost like this temple is a living temple, right?
So was Solomon the main architect here too, or did he get a vision from God how to do this, or who?
You know,
Architect.
we're not 100% sure how much of this is just Solomon's idea. When David makes his plans for the temple, it is pretty clear, I think, at least grammatically, that he has literally like physical layouts of what he's envisioning.
Back to David's time.
Yeah. Now, we don't actually hear for sure that Solomon uses those exact layouts. Solomon obviously is wiser than David. I think we can say that kind of confidently based off of Scripture. It's very possible that Solomon takes those and refines them and does them his own way. It's very possible, I think, that the Holy Spirit is actively at work here in the life of Solomon, guiding him in how to build this temple. But yeah, it is, at least to the best of our knowledge scripturally, Solomon is the primary designer, so to speak. And I just love that image, right, of all those gourds and open flowers that are being carved into the walls. There's craftsmanship going on here, isn't it? Just this beautiful, beautiful sanctuary. The inner sanctuary he prepared in the innermost part of the house to set there the ark of the covenant of the Lord. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 20 cubits high. So inside that box that we have, he separates out this most holy place. 20 cubits by 20 cubits by 20 cubits. So it's a perfect cube, right? Yeah. Which I think probably does have something to say there about who God is, that there is this rational ordering to God to a degree, that he has committed himself to these laws that he uses in nature. But of course, as I think about miracles, he sometimes breaks those laws a little bit to bring himself glory. But yeah, there's this beautiful 20 cubit by 20 cubit by 20 cubit, so 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet. Just most holy place in kind of the back of it. He also overlaid an altar of cedar. Oh, pardon me. And he overlaid it with pure gold. So this whole most holy place is overlaid with pure gold. You got 30 feet by 30 feet by 30 feet of pure gold covering this most holy place. He also overlaid an altar of cedar. And Solomon overlaid the inside of the house with pure gold. And he drew chains of gold across in front of the inner sanctuary and overlaid it with gold. And he overlaid the whole house with gold until all the house was finished. So this whole house has gold throughout. Like, there's beauty here, there's wealth here, there's honor here. They're, again, trying to make sure that this is a holy place, a distinct place, like no other place, for them at least, on earth. They want it to be special. In the inner sanctuary, he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high. So he's got these cherubim of olive wood that are 15 feet high. 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. The other cherub also measured 10 cubits. Both cherubim had the same measure and the same form. The height of one cherub was 10 cubits, and so was that of the other cherub. He put the cherubim in the innermost part of the house, and the wings of the cherubim were spread out so that a wing of one touched the one wall, and a wing of the other cherub touched the other wall. Their other wings touched each other in the middle of the house, and he overlaid the cherubim with gold. So as we're picturing this then, you've got these 2 cherubs, these cherubim, that are angelic in some way. I actually have a video that I'd love to show, but it might get pushed off till next time, which is fine, of just kind of an artist rendering of the temple as a whole, just going step by step through it. It'll actually probably work better next time since we'll get through all of the individual little parts, bronze pieces that are out there too. But as you're picturing these cherubs, so you've got the wings out like this, and then you've got another one with wings out like this, inside the most holy place. And I found this interesting. I was just listening to someone talking about this, and again, as we were talking about that, how you're getting closer to God, right? In the ancient world, in Genesis, back if we look at that expulsion from the Garden of Eden, what guards people from going back into the garden?
Angels.
Yeah,
Angels.
angels, specifically a cherub with a flaming sword. So as you're trying to go westward to get back to God, what stops you? Cherub. Now, they were pointing out that as you're entering into the most holy of holies, you're entering into the presence of God. But I find it interesting that the last thing that you run into, like the thing that would probably be on the wall there, right, kind of backed up against the wall, what's still there separating you from God's presence? These 2 cherubs, right? I think there's almost even in the architecture the sense that, hey, yeah, God has promised to be here. He's promised to make his presence, but can we really be in his presence? No. And of course, that's one of the beautiful things at the death of Christ. You see this splitting of that curtain that separates the holy from the most holy place. What's God promising there?
You can go directly to him now. You don't need,
Yeah.
the doors are open.
Yeah, there isn't this separation anymore. That God has entered into the lives of his people and he's standing in their midst. That he's coming into our hearts, that he's breaking into our lives. It's this beautiful promise that that separation is done away with. Now, granted, there is still separation in part. We know this. This is that simultaneously saint and sinner that Luther talks about all the time. that separation, that partial separation, is going to be done away with. But right now, we're still in God's presence right now, because He's said, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to be in your presence. And that's a beautiful thing, I think, as we think about the difference between that Old Testament temple and the New Testament temple, namely Christ and His body, and that He continues to speak into our lives today. What time is it? All right. We're just going to cruise through the last part here, and I apologize for that, but next week, or next time we gather, I promise that it'll all be kind of coalesced as we get to actually look at the temple together, at least an artist rendering what it would be, because that's going to be so much better than me trying to describe it anyway. Around all the walls of the house, he carved engraved figures of cherubim and palm trees and open flowers in the inner and outer rooms. The floor of the house he overlaid with gold in the inner and outer rooms. Sorry, I do have to briefly stop there. Can you imagine having a floor that's made out of gold? Yeah. Gold is so...
Take your shoes
Yeah,
off.
yeah. Take your shoes off, please. Yeah. Which, to be fair, was a Middle Eastern practice, that you regularly would take your shoes off when you entered into a home because you don't want to track your dirt all over it. But yeah, gold is such a common resource for Solomon. And he's like, oh yeah, I can pave the floor in gold. It's fine. We can walk all over it, right? There's no issue there.
Pastor, so, but for the Holy of Holies, if I remember this right, the priest goes in, right? I mean, the high priest.
Yeah, the high priest enters once a year.
Once a year.
Once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the high priest is able to enter into the most holy of holies. Otherwise, no one gets in.
Nobody dusts in there.
Yep, nobody goes in there and dusts. Yeah.
Maybe he does that when he goes in.
That's a good question. Yeah, I've never thought about that. Does he actually do that? Although, as we talk about this, it's very clear, we'll see this next week too, that God's presence in some way, shape, or form literally descends upon this temple. So I would wager that God can take care of the dusting to a degree himself. He doesn't necessarily need us to go in there and clean that out for him. He can probably make sure that happens. But yeah, it's a beautiful image. For the entrance to the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood. The lintel and the doorposts were 5-sided. He covered the 2 doors of olive wood with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He overlaid them with gold and spread gold on the cherubim and on the palm trees. So also he made for the entrance to the nave doorposts of olive wood in the form of a square and 2 doors of cypress wood. The 2 leaves of the one door were folding, and the 2 leaves of the other door were folding. On them he carved cherubim and palm trees and open flowers, and he overlaid them with gold evenly applied on the carved work. He built the inner court with 3 courses of cut stone and 1 course of cedar beams. In the 4th year, the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid in the month of Ziv. And in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, which is the 8th month, the house was finished in all its parts and according to all its specifications. He was 7 years in building it. And so we see that as they're really trying to make this temple beautiful, they spend 7 years, and that's obviously a significant number, that number of completion that's happening here. This temple is everything it was supposed to be. The problem is that we're not everything we're supposed to be, and so we need more than just a temple in our midst. We need God himself in the form of Christ. But we'll look at that some more next week, or next time, pardon. And we'll see, I think, a little more clearly just how beautiful this temple looks as we look at this video. Let's close with a word of prayer, and we'll pray ourselves into lunch. Lord God Almighty, we thank you for this opportunity to be gathered as your people, to look at this faithful expression of holiness, this desire that Solomon had to glorify you, to bring you glory, to build this beautiful temple for you. Lord, we pray that you would help us to do beautiful things for you, but not just beautiful buildings, not just beautiful structures, but Lord, we pray that you would continue to make us beautiful by your Spirit, that we would do beautiful works, works that bring you glory, works that point others to the beauty in our lives, that beauty of your Son, who has died and risen again, that we might have everlasting life. We ask this all in your Son's most precious name. Amen.